The night of October 30th, 1975. A gated community in Greenwich, Connecticut, one of the most expensive zip codes in the United States. The houses are worth millions. The families inside are connected to the biggest corporations in America, to Wall Street, to the White House. There are no strangers in Bellhaven. Nothing bad happens in Bellhaven. Until it does. The next morning, a 15-year-old girl was found under a pine tree in her own backyard, beaten to death with a golf club. The murder weapon had come from the house directly across the street, the home of the Scalel family, one of the most powerful clans in New England, cousins by marriage to the Kennedys. It would take 27 years to get an arrest. The man eventually convicted served 11 years before his conviction was overturned. Nobody else was charged. The case is still officially open. Her name was Martha Moxley. She was 15 years old. And 50 years later, nobody is in prison for what happened to her. We're so grateful for our loyal viewers and appreciate all the kind words and input you're sending our way in the comments. If you want to support the channel further, please subscribe and turn on all notifications. People who watch from bell notifications really help us spread our videos, so we're super grateful for every bell viewer out there. Who was Martha? Martha Elizabeth Moxley was 15 years old, a sophomore at Greenwich High School, and by every account one of those kids who lights up a room. Her family had moved from Piedmont, California, to 38 Walsh Lane in Bellhaven just a year before. Her father, J. David Moxley, was a managing partner at the accounting firm Tush Ross. Within 9 months of arriving, Martha had been voted best personality at her old junior high. She kept a diary. She had plans. The neighborhood she moved into was something else entirely. Bellhaven sits on a grated peninsula on Long Island Sound. About 120 homes. No outsiders. Teenagers ran freely between houses, especially gravitating toward the one with the least supervision. The Scalel house at 71 Otter Rock Drive, less than 200 yards away. The Scalels. Rushton Scalel Sr. was chairman of Great Lakes Carbon Corporation, one of the largest privately held companies in the country. His sister Ethel Scalel had married Robert F. Kennedy, which put the whole family inside the force field of Kennedy privilege. After Rushton's wife Anne died of brain cancer in 1973, the household fell apart. 7 children, a frequently absent father, unlimited money, and essentially no rules. Michael Scalel would later write that he became a daily drinking alcoholic by the time he was 13. A former nanny described her legs as black and blue from the kids kicking her. On the night of October 30th, 1975, there were 2 Scalel brothers in particular paying attention to Martha. Thomas, 17, and Michael, 15. She had written about both of them in her diary, noting their rivalry for her attention. That rivalry is one of the threads that runs through everything. The last night. Rushton Sr. was out of town. So was Martha's father. It was mischief night. No school the next day. There was also a newcomer in the Scalel house. Kenneth Littleton was a 23-year-old Williams College graduate hired as the family's live-in tutor. October 30th, 1975 was literally his first night on the job. Martha spent the early evening with friends, eventually landing at the Scalel house. Around 9 p.m., she, Michael, and a couple of other kids were sitting in the family's Lincoln Continental in the driveway, listening to music. Then Tommy came out, slid into the front seat next to Martha, and started flirting. The other kids drifted away, a little put off by it. Around 9:30 p.m., Martha's friend Helen Ix last saw Tommy and Martha roughhousing and falling together behind a fence near the Scalel pool. That was the last confirmed sighting of Martha alive. Her curfew was 9:30 p.m. She never made it home. Meanwhile, Michael left with his brothers and cousin Jimmy Terrian to drive to the Terrian house to watch Monty Python on television. That's his alibi for the next 2 hours. He would later change the details of his story in ways that became very significant. The discovery. Dorothy Moxley spent the night calling friends, calling the Scalel house, driving around. Tommy told her by phone that Martha had left at 9:30. Greenwich police were called at 3:48 a.m. At around 12:30 p.m. on October 31st, Martha's friend Sheila McGuire took a shortcut through the Moxley backyard. She found the body beneath a large pine tree, roughly 70 feet from the driveway. Martha had been struck at least 8 or 9 times in the head with a golf club, with such force that the shaft snapped. The broken shaft was then driven through her neck. The violence was extreme. This was not an accident. The golf club was identified as a Tony Penner 6-iron from a set that had belonged to Anne Scalel. A matching 4-iron from the same set was still at the Scalel house. A canvass of the entire neighborhood found no other Tony Penner clubs anywhere in Belhaven. The weapon had come from directly across the street. Why the case went cold? The Greenwich Police Department was, by any measure, out of its depth. One detective later admitted, "Maybe we weren't aggressive enough. We were really novices at this." No search warrant was executed on the Scalel house. The coroner wasn't at the scene. The autopsy was delayed, making time of death impossible to pin down precisely. And then there was the Scalel family. On January 22, 1976, less than 3 months after the murder, Rushton Scalel formally ended his family's cooperation with investigators. A request by the police chief to arrest Thomas Scalel was denied by the state's attorney. The file stayed open, but effectively dead for the next 15 years. Thomas Scalel. Tommy was, for a long time, the prime suspect. And the case for him is real. He was the last confirmed person with Martha, alone with her from roughly 9:30 p.m. onwards. His original alibi, that he went inside to write an Abraham Lincoln school paper, was a fabrication. No teacher at his school ever assigned that paper. When the Scalel family hired the private investigator firm Sutton Associates in the early 1990s, supposedly to clear their name, Tommy admitted to investigators what actually happened. He and Martha engaged in a sexual encounter, and she left just before 10 p.m. He had been lying to police for nearly 20 years. The Sutton Associates profilers, all trained FBI, described the likely killer as a 14 to 18-year-old who lived within walking distance, same social class as the victim, significant sibling rivalry, and under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Tommy fits that description. He never had an alibi for the full window. The case against Tommy has 2 complicating factors. He passed a polygraph, though polygraph results are considered unreliable enough that most courts won't admit them as evidence. And Ken Littleton told investigators Tommy was inside watching The French Connection with him by around 10 to 10:30 p.m. If that's accurate, and if Martha died around 10 p.m., Tommy's window is extremely tight. He was never charged. Kenneth Littleton. The tutor who arrived on the very day of the murder failed at least 2 polygraph tests and then had a complete personal disintegration. Arrests for burglary, shoplifting, assault, serial DWIs, and what his lawyers described as severe bipolar disorder, became a serious person of interest for years. But the arguments against Littleton are strong. He never met Martha Moxley. He didn't know the neighborhood. The manner of the killing, a sustained rage-fueled attack with a weapon grabbed from a neighboring family's house, indicates someone with a prior relationship with the victim. Littleton had no motive anyone could identify. He was eventually granted immunity in exchange for grand jury testimony. He died in 2019, never charged. An unknown third party. Some have floated the idea that someone from outside Belhaven, or a friend of a friend, was responsible. In 2003, a man named Tony Bryant, a cousin of Kobe Bryant, claimed 2 friends from the Bronx committed the murder. All 3 invoked the Fifth Amendment. A Superior Court judge found Bryant's account not credible in 2007. There is no physical evidence of any outsider at the scene. Belhaven was a gated community with its own security force. This theory requires a chain of coincidences that simply don't hold up. Let's work through what we actually know, because the answer has been staring at this case for 50 years. The murder weapon definitively came from the Scalel house. The victim was last seen alive at the Scalel house, in intimate contact with a member of the Scalel family. The Scalel family hired their own investigators, and when those investigators pointed the finger at their own sons, they shut the investigation down and buried the report. Both primary scalal suspects lied to police. The police were too outgunned and too differential to a wealthy, connected family to push through it. Thomas Scalal cannot be ruled out. He lied about the alibi. He admitted to a sexual encounter with Martha, ending around 10 p.m. If the time of death window is wider than investigators initially believed, and the delayed autopsy means it very possibly is, Tommy had the opportunity. And when you have a 17-year-old boy who has just been physically rejected or interrupted in some way, who is likely drunk, and who is standing in a yard that contains golf clubs he knows are there, the scenario writes itself. But the evidence the prosecution ultimately built, and the evidence that survives independent scrutiny, points more specifically to Michael Scalal. Here is what Michael himself admitted over time and under different levels of pressure. He was jealous of his older brother. He was furious that Martha seemed to prefer Tommy. He was outside at the Moxley property late that night, by his own account, in a tree, throwing pebbles at Martha's window. He heard noises in the bushes. His own audio memoir, recorded in 1997 to explain himself, placed him at the scene at a time he had previously denied being there. Then there are the Alan School statements. The school in Maine where Michael was sent in 1978 after a drunk driving arrest was a brutal residential facility. Attack therapy, forced confessions, physical confrontations. Multiple former students told investigators that Michael, over an extended period, made incriminating statements about Martha's death, with the most specific being, "I'm going to get away with murder. I'm a Kennedy." There are credibility problems with some of those witnesses. The lead witness died of a heroin overdose before the 2002 trial, and another later recanted. These statements cannot be treated as definitive. But the pattern across multiple people at multiple points is hard to dismiss entirely. The prosecution's theory of motive is straightforward and fits the evidence. Michael returned to the Moxley property that night, intending to see Martha, intending perhaps to try what Tommy had just done. She rejected him, or ignored him. Or he looked through a window, or heard something that confirmed she had chosen Tommy. Whatever the trigger, he came apart. He picked up the golf club from his own family's property, and he attacked her. As we've seen, the Sutton profilers described the offender as a teenager driven by deep-seated jealousy and anger, likely intoxicated, acting in a burst of rage rather than premeditation. That description fits the evidence of the crime scene. Frenzied, excessive force, no concealment of the body. This wasn't planned. This was someone who lost control and then fled. Here's the thing about the conviction and its aftermath. Michael Scalal was found guilty in 2002. He had that conviction overturned in 2018, not because new evidence exonerated him, but because his trial lawyer, Michael Sherman, failed to track down a key alibi witness who could have contradicted the prosecution's characterization of Michael's timeline. The Connecticut Supreme Court found the defense was constitutionally inadequate. In 2020, prosecutors declined to retry him, citing the death of 17 potential witnesses over the intervening years. An overturned conviction is not an exoneration. Nobody has produced new forensic evidence pointing away from Michael. Nobody has produced a credible alternative suspect. What the court found was that the defense was incompetent, not that the wrong person was accused. The case remains officially open. Dorothy Moxley, Martha's mother, spent almost 5 decades fighting for answers. She died on December 24, 2024, at age 92, without seeing anyone held accountable. The murder weapon came from the house across the street. The last 2 people with Martha that night were both members of that family. The most likely explanation, the one that requires the fewest assumptions and fits the most evidence, is that Michael Scalal killed Martha Moxley in a jealous rage on the night of October 30th, 1975, and that a combination of wealth, family connections, a botched investigation, and an incompetent defense allowed him to walk free. Martha Moxley was 15 years old. She was 5 weeks away from her 16th birthday. So, where does your head land on this one? Tommy's window is tight, but it's there, and he lied for 2 decades. Michael's evidence is more extensive, but he walked. Drop your read in the comments. This is one of those cases where reasonable people disagree, and I want to hear the case for whoever you think did it. And a different question to close on. This case sat cold for more than 2 decades before journalists and authors forced it back into the light. Mark Furman, Dominic Dunn, Timothy Dumas. Is there a cold case in your country or region where you think media pressure is the only thing that will ever force a reckoning? What's the case that deserves that kind of heat? Let us know below. Do you want to bring bad things with you wherever you go? Our episodes are now available as a podcast. Look us up on your favorite podcast app and listen to the most truth-seeking true crime podcast out there.